Hey everyone, tuning in from home. I didn't have my normal webcam, so sorry for the graininess. I wanted to make sure that I could go through the test one with you so that you had means of reviewing it if you wanted to while you're home on break. So I'm going to share screen and then try and pull up our exam. All right, so we've got our first question, which deals with our circulating air masses. If you remember that these air masses kind of have their own names, but I wasn't requiring you to learn them. The polar cells up at the top, kind of the Hadley cells down towards the area where we're located. But the big take home message here is how do they explain those biome patterns in climate and vegetation? It all has to do with how they circulate the moisture, right? So they're going to be varying. Every other latitude is going to be either wet or dry. And that's why kind of that sponge effect that we had talked about in class, that towards the equator, it's going to be really wet, that water is being drawn up, rising, cooling, condensing, and it's going to rain down, and then the air mass is dry and it moves to the next latitude, and we have dry kind of conditions. And then the same thing kind of happens as it moves to those other latitudes, and that's why we see that variation according to latitude that we're looking at, from the tropics all the way up to the poles. Every other one's going to be dry or wet. So that's a good explanation on that one. Circulating air masses. This next one, give an example of biotic factors that limit the distribution of another organism. And I mentioned it can come from any of these habitats, but I guess, I'm thinking back to some of the examples we covered. If we were talking about disease, we gave the example of Hawaii and the birds kind of moving up higher in elevation to avoid some of those parasites and diseases that were coming in. For example, malarial mosquitoes and whatnot. We also talked about out in Australia, the burrowing baton, right? That was that kind of kangaroo rat type organism. And it was limited, kind of moved from its original range out onto some islands to avoid the introduced foxes. And remember, for that, they kind of had to reintroduce them, fence off the foxes, and then they had that poison pea plant. With competitors, there's lots of different examples, but certainly an invasive species that came in, they usually have some kind of competitive edge, and typically no predators, so they could outcompete any of the organisms that are found within that community originally. So those would just be some examples of biotic factors limiting the distribution, the location of a given organism. And in terms of biotic, we mean kind of living things, right? Abiotic certainly would be, drought conditions or limited nutrients. Our next question, imagine what it's like for a plant and animal living in an urban microhabitat. What are the environmental conditions like? Explain why they might thrive there. So usually there's heat islands that are in these urban areas, right? It's a little bit warmer, it's a lot more buildings, and impervious surface. So like the driveways and pavement and stuff, it gets a lot warmer. And the farther out you go from the center of the city, the more parks you're going to see, the more green space, more trees, which is going to buffer it, maybe even some ponds, again, kind of making it a little more moderate in temperature. But certainly ectotherms would benefit from an area that was, urban. Oftentimes they're using the structure, right? So I think we gave the example with bats roosting under the Congress Avenue Bridge in Texas, right? That was in Austin, Texas. I think we mentioned also that the turtles like to nest on the edge of the road. They can easily dig in the sand and lay their eggs, and it's also warmer, and they prefer that. Bats that are also feeding on insects that are attracted to lights. There's often more lights in the city. So there's lots of examples of organisms that would do well. I think a lot of you guys even gave examples of, say, squirrels and raccoons and whatnot that might be coming in to feed on garbage or, you know, bird feeders and whatnot in people's communities, which is totally a great example of that too. Question 4, this is an example of a rain shadow, right? So we gave this example kind of thinking about how deserts were formed. And this might be, say, the coast of California. You've got warm, moist air moving across, rising, cooling, and condensing. So it gets wet on that left-hand side of the mountain. Now your air mass is dry, moving on to the other side. So you'll have your arid habitat, your desert, adapted plants, maybe even photosynthesis, which you can see there. It notes the word arid, so probably aridosol type soils. Moving on to the next page, explain a concept you learned in the class, not asked on the exam. Those are usually my freebies, right? Just tell me a little bit about what you've learned. So everybody did pretty well if they answered that. Question 6, what are the pore openings in the leaves of terrestrial plants that allow for that carbon dioxide to come in so the plants can begin photosynthesis? So when we look at our options here, the stomates or the stomata, those are the holes where those pores, the pores where the gas exchange can occur. Chloroplast, obviously, where the chlorophyll is stored. Photosynthesis proceeds at a maximum if there is strong blank pressure that maintains the cell's rigidity. So we're talking about something that's going to make that plant stiff. And when we look down our list here, we've got Coriolis effect, which deals with wind. We've got El Nino, which we know is kind of that cyclical, kind of periodic climate shift where we can have drought, and then we can have, extreme precipitation in one area. Adiabatic cooling, that has to do with gas expansion at night in the desert when it's pretty cloudless and how cold it can get in the desert. We also mentioned that a little bit on the tops of mountains with, again, that gas expansion. But turgor or turgor pressure is the correct answer that we're looking for here. The more turgid that plant is, the stiffer it'll be and the better it will photosynthesize. Completely submerged aquatic plants uptake their carbon most often in the form of, and this is through diffusion across their membranes. Now remember, any plant that's floating on the top, so like a macrophyte, one example I think was the pickleweed or any of the lily pads that you might encounter, they still are on the top, floating on the top, so they will have stomata for gas exchange. But if a plant, we're talking like milfoil or some of the seaweeds that we're seeing, those would be diffusing bicarbonate. The carbon comes in as bicarbonate. Number 7, organisms at great ocean depths. And we're talking about energy needs when they're far away from, the photic zone right at the top where sunlight can actually penetrate. You've got most of our plants and algae kind of growing. These are talking about organisms that are down in the deep depths in the abyssal area. And for those organisms, they have to switch from using solar radiation to another energy source. So we're talking about methane in one case, oxidation of methane in one case. We're talking about use of sulfur in another. And we look at our options here. Pools and riffles had to do with our moving water, right? So the lodic rivers and whatnot. The benthic sediments, this is sort of just at the bottom of a pond. Littoral shallows would be kind of the edge of the water as you're kind of walking out into a beach, perhaps. So we're really narrowing down to these cold seeps and these hydrothermal vents. And one of the ways, I don't know if I mentioned this in class, one of the ways I keep track of this is when I think of hydrothermal vents, I think of a thermos, and a thermos can keep soup warm. So that's the S. So we're talking about the sulfur compounds for the hydrothermal vents. And then when we talk about these cold seeps, it's often the methane that we're dealing with. All right, moving on to the next question. New York State DEC has a law that is prohibiting transport of firewood greater than 50 miles, right? We don't want those invasive species. We don't want to move emerald ash borer or any of those spotted lantern flies, which, by the way, I don't know if you guys caught SNL this past week, I think it was, but there was a pretty funny lantern fly, spotted lantern fly segment. I was going to post it, but it was kind of raunchy, so I didn't go for it. But it might make you laugh, given what you know a little bit about it. They're really a nuisance, and they're moving in from kind of New Jersey, Pennsylvania area up to where we are. And that's going to be a huge concern for grape growers, right? All of the vineyards that we've got in the Finger Lakes, and for the apple orchards too. They really like these fruit crop kind of plants. So anyways, you and your friends are heading to the western edge of the Adirondack Park. Okay, so again, the blue line boundary that you can see over here, the western edge. So you're heading over in this direction. And so you basically go on to the kind of the campground website, and you tell them where you're going to be coming from and going to. It will put this boundary, so that circle kind of shows up. So I used my house and put the boundary around it. So I am okay to move wood from my house anywhere in this zone to any of the campgrounds that might fall in that location. But if I wanted to go with my friends to the western part of the park, outside of that boundary, I'm going to be beyond my 15 meters. So if I did bring wood, which would be a no-no, that would be an example, if there was an insect in it, of what kind of dispersal. So remember, diffusion was something, very short. It takes a really long time, right? If you think about how the seed rains down from a tree, right? It's just kind of small incremental movement and creeping. But jump dispersal would involve a helper, and we could be the helper, loading it into our vehicles. So that would be jump dispersal. Next page. Okay. A blank lake is characterized by high nutrient concentrations. So let's take a look. So a blank lake, so we're thinking about a state of the lake here, with high nutrient concentrations and plankton blooms with low light penetration. So if we're thinking about a state of a lake, then it's going to be either eutrophic or oligotrophic, right? Remember, the eutrophic is the one that smells, right? It's kind of mucky and murky, and it has probably a lot of algae. So when it's eutrophic, that's going to have the high nutrient concentrations, those blooms. And if that were the case, what's the water going to look like? And as we look down the list here, it's certainly not going to be blue and clear. That's what an oligotrophic would look like. It's probably going to be green and cloudy. Right? Over here, carnivorous plants. So now we're talking about like sundews and pitcher plants, right? These are plants that will trap and digest organisms, and they're doing that partly because they're in really low nutrient type habitats. So they're in bogs and maybe some fens. They're largely going to be digesting them from the nitrogen that they can find within those organisms. And they would be considered, again, carnivorous plants. What are they? They are still plants, right? So they're still going to have photosynthetic pigment. They're still going to be pulling in carbon to make their sugars. So they are autotrophs. They are not heterotrophs that are requiring other organisms to provide, sugar for them. They're just in a really low nitrogen kind of habitat. So that's why they're digesting those supplemental organisms. They're still considered true plants and are autotrophs. 11, which below are morphological adaptations that are not associated with desert plants? So you can kind of go through the list here. Waxy cuticle, check, right? That makes sense. It's going to prevent water loss. Microphylla, remember phylla means leaves, micro is small. So the smaller your leaf, the less it's going to heat up, less water that could potentially be lost. Those seem to make sense. Elevated stomata in relation to leaf surface area. So this was the one that I kind of threw in there to catch you guys. We have talked about sunken stomates, right? Sunken stomates are going to be protected from the wind, from evapotranspiration, but elevated would make them more likely to lose water out of their leaves, out of those pores, right? So that one we're tagging as potential. Nurse plants, remember, those are the helpers. It's like a tree, or it's maybe a big cactus and a seed rolls underneath it, and now it's sheltered from direct sun. It might access some of the nutrients and some of the water that's associated with the other tree. Over time, the tree that it's, or the plant that's being nurtured, is going to outcompete and may kill the nurse plant. But that is something that we do see in the desert. Many little cacti growing underneath the base of, say, a Palo Verde tree. And then photosynthetic bark. So speaking of Palo Verde, those would be trees that have chlorophyll within their bark, because they could potentially lose leaves if things got too tough. So elevated stomates is the one that we would say is not associated with a desert plant. That would be kind of counterintuitive. It's sunken stomates that they have. Ecology is best defined as, and if we look through this list, certainly interaction between species and communities seems to make sense, but that only is the biotic angle, right? That's only taking into account the biotics. So relationship between biotic organisms and the abiotic environment, that's going to be the most appropriate. Yes, there's going to be discussion of evolution of individuals. Yes, there'll be the anthropogenic stuff. We've already talked about influence, sort of human impact. And certainly in terms of conservation, towards the end of the semester, we'll talk about that. But the relationship between organisms, biotic and abiotic environment, would be the most appropriate. All right, a blank ecologist, now we're getting at the levels of ecology, right? A blank ecologist would investigate questions about cycling of water and nutrients. In this case, we've got all our lists, right? Molecular and organismal, these are in community and population. These all kind of speak to the organism, right? And to the population, grouping of populations as communities. So if we're going to think about how nutrients are moving up a food chain, right, moving through the system, moving through those communities from, say, the plants on up to the herbivores, on up to the predators, and then everybody's dying, and the nutrients kind of return back into the system. In that kind of scenario, we're talking about ecosystem level. All right, 14. Proper freshwater dimictic lake pond zonation. So we want to write our zones. I think you saw this on the quiz, right? So we look through our list here, knowing that like our skin, right? The outer part of our skin is the epidermis. So the epilimnion would be the top. And then we look at the two that are options here. Hypo is under, right? So that's actually the bottom layer. So we can eliminate this first one, and we would be focused here. So epilimnion on the top, meta in the middle, and hypo down at the bottom. Number 15. Certain plants struggle to uptake O2. Which of the following adaptations helps address this issue? Let's see. So we know there's an option here for everything to be correct. Then we've got the Rhynchoma, which for those that went out on the field trip with me, I think I pulled up that cattail so you could see kind of the opening. And I think I mentioned it looked like okra on the inside. It's got those gaps and air spaces that help in gas exchange. Lenticels, these are pictured on a slide that has, I think, a cherry tree. If you've ever looked at the bark on a smooth cherry tree, it's often kind of a brownish reddish, kind of like a ruddy brown color, smooth, and there's these kind of white lines that run horizontal, and these are ways, they're called lenticels, so ways that gas can exchange as well. And then pneumatophores, we're thinking like pneumonia, right? But this is sort of a way that organisms that are like the mangroves, right? The mangrove islands that we see in the tropics are able to do some gas exchange too. So actually all of these are ways that they can help give some of that oxygen. Okay, so C4 plants. Temperate areas have mostly C3, C4, it moves into those warmer areas. So when we kind of look through our list here, they perform light reactions during the day and uptake CO2 from their stomata at night. Remember that temporal separation was the CAM plants, the desert plants. So that one's not. They use water more efficiently and deal with the warmer temperatures better than C3 plants. Well, that makes sense, right? We're getting into these warmer biomes. They perform carbon fixation steps in photosynthesis in the bundle sheet cells. Well, that is likely plausible too, right? They have spatial separation of the steps in photosynthesis. They've got an extra structure. They are primarily woody and are common in the northern latitudes, like the forest and the tundra. Remember, we are sort of in the realm of moving into from the temperate up into the boreal, and then we've got tundra. If you remember that slide, there was kind of a cool slide that they had, tundra and then boreal and then temperate. Then it had I think tropics, and then it had prairie, and then it moved over to more of our scrub shrub savanna on up to the CAM desert plants. And remember the transition went from like C3, C4s as we're getting into the grassy stuff, C4s as we're getting into some of the shrub grassy stuff, and then CAM as we go up. So in this case, those woody plants are more C3 instead of C4. And C4 plants tend to be a little bit more herbaceous. And we also know that they deal better with the water loss, right? So B and C would be correct here. So an organism that receives energy from solar radiation, so sun, so photo kind of makes sense, right? That's sort of what we're talking about. And then carbon coming from atmospheric carbon dioxide. And that kind of probably should trigger plants in the mind. So an autotroph, so they can make their food themselves. So photo sunlight, autotroph making food themselves. So we're talking about our plants here. And photo autotroph would be appropriate. All right, moving into statistics, way back from our first lecture. Okay, so we're looking for a statistical test to determine the difference in the mean weight. And remember, weight is a quantity, right? So it's a quantitative variable. Remember, the two types of quantitative variables are discrete or continuous. If we're talking weight, there can be a decimal here. We can kind of measure a variation here. So in this case, we're looking at a continuous variable we're measuring. We're comparing it across two trials. And so if we've got a variable that's quantitative, we're just seeing if there's a difference in the means of these two groups, these two feeding groups that we're evaluating. Then we would do a t-test, right? That compares the two. And if you kind of think about what you did, right? You had a muskrat head length, right? You have the leg fill width. And you wanted to know if those were different across two different marshes or two different locations. So you also would do a t-test on that. A plant in sandy soil would have a greater root to shoot ratio as compared to one in clay soils. Okay. So you think about sand, right? There's big particles, the water kind of diffusing quickly through the large pore spaces. The plant is going to have a hard time hanging on to the water, right, in that kind of soil. So it would probably make sense to have more roots as opposed to more shoots above ground, right? It's going to be dry soil. So they need to develop more of their energy towards making structure below ground to grab onto that water. Clay will have, a lot of surface area volume that's going to hang onto those water molecules, and so it can actually grow taller, right? The plants would have a little bit more above ground, probably than root. All right, question 20. We ran a statistical test to determine if there's a difference in mean carrot length across 3 soil types. And we resulted in an output of a p-value. So that kind of narrows stuff down. T-test, again, comparing across 2 sites. So we know that's not going to work. We've got 3 sites. Well, 3 sites typically draws us to an ANOVA. Okay, especially with a p-value as our output. So in this case, we look for a p-value, and now we want to interpret it. Well, that p-value is less than 0.05. When it's less than 0.05, there is a statistical difference. When it's greater than 0.05, there is no statistical difference. So this is the correct answer. And then if after you perform this experiment, you decide it's important to see the impact of road salt on carrot mass, you are trying to test if one thing causes something, right? So you really want to tease something apart. You want to get at the causal mechanisms. So if you want to get at those causal mechanisms, you're not going to do a field or a natural experiment, because then there's many different things that are involved. A mesocosm gets you closer, but you still aren't 100% sure that it wasn't like two things that caused that. So a greenhouse experiment, especially when we're dealing with carrots, right? It's not going to be in a carrion type setting, would be the way to go. So greenhouse is appropriate. The trend you found was plotted below, like on this graph below. What kind of graph is this? And you look below, well, there's no bar, right? And bars are also found on a histogram, which is that frequency distribution. And so that leaves us with scatter plot, which makes sense. There's a scattering of locations or dots here, and you can fit a trend line to that. If you fit a linear trend line to it, you're talking about a linear regression to see if salt caused that increase in mass. And in terms of it being influential, us asking that question, well, up here you'll see there's a R-squared value that's close to 1. Remember, anything close to 1, you picked a good variable to help determine and distinguish what caused that growth. So in this case, we would say yes, because that R-squared is close to 1. Okay, when coring soil horizons, you're looking for the greatest organic, the most rich in diversity, most rich in nutrient kind of soil layer. Remember, I mentioned O and A kind of up towards the top. We're going to have, pretty rich nutrients and diversity. E is the zone of leaching, and then R was the bedrock. So in this case, you would say O and A. All right, threats to the Arctic and boreal forest regions. When we take a look over here, you'll see there's melting permafrost and methane being released. That's true. We talked about that being a concern, right? Going from sinks to sources. Wildfires due to lightning strikes. I think I mentioned there were a lot of fires up where I am doing my research, right? So that's kind of true. Deforestation not really happening up in that area, to a tremendous amount. So the proper answer would actually be both methane release due to the melting permafrost and those wildfires. Threats to the temperate, increased grass encroachment. We're not really seeing that happen all that much. Invasive forest pests, you guys saw one was passed around to you, and we talked about that a lot. Urban sprawl, certainly, we're in a temperate forest, so there's a lot of, building going on. So urban sprawl makes sense. And therefore, urban sprawl and invasive pests would be appropriate. Threats to the tropical rainforest, climate change resulting in a shift in carbon sink and source dynamic. I think we mentioned that was going to be one of the things we worried about. The Amazon experiencing multiple years of drought, right? Very important that these big trees are found there in abundance, right? They're pulling in our carbon dioxide. But if they're dying over multiple years of drought, they're going to start releasing some of that carbon as they decay. And so that's where that comes into play. In terms of urban sprawl, we don't see a ton of that occurring. Yes, there's areas where villages are being established, but I wouldn't necessarily bring that to the level of urban sprawl. An example of an anthrome, as you kind of look down the list here, all of those are appropriate examples of anthromes where we can imagine humans were involved in creating each of those habitats. Down at 23 here, a wetland that dries up by the end of the summer. When we look down the list here, we've been out to swamps. These are kind of the border areas of marshes where there might be some more kind of trees that are submerged. Bogs, we talked about them in the boreal forest, where the water's coming in through rainfall, it's kind of permanently kind of soggy, like the scotosols. Marshes are going to have that marsh grass and be submerged majority of the time as well. The fen is kind of like a bog, except the way that it receives its moisture is different. Vernal pool, these are also called ephemeral ponds. Vernal means spring. They show up in the spring, right, from the snow melting in these depressional areas, these kind of pits and mound topography that you find in, say, Ruger Woods, for example. If you ever hike out in there, you'll see areas where maybe like trees have rolled up over the years, and now there's this gap. And the snow will accumulate and will melt. But by the time summer rolls around, it's dried out again. So vernal pool would be the appropriate one. And then we want to know what wetland is, sort of very acidic, receiving water through rainfall, it's like peat moss mostly. And we know that that's probably going to be either a fen or a bog. And the bog gets its moisture from rainfall, whereas the fen has kind of an inlet and outlet source. We move down here to our matching. High rates of nutrient cycling. We associated that with the tropical rainforest, right? We were afraid that that was one of the concerns with deforestation, that the nutrients are tied up in the trees and the rates of decomposition are really fast because the conditions are moist and really warm. So the bacteria and fungus and whatnot that are in organisms, like our insects, are breaking stuff down really rapidly. So high rates of nutrient cycling in the tropics, a graminoid grass-dominated wetland. So again, looking down the list here for wetlands, not these two, not that, could be that, but it's not grass-dominated, right? It could be a marsh. Yes, it is a marsh, right? We've been out to Osable Marsh, Wickham Marsh. I think some of you might have seen it, but these are dominated by grasses. Land of little sticks and forest fires. That's arboreal forest, the taiga. Boat ballast water and zebra mussels. So boat ballast water could have been marine ocean, could have been fresh water, right? It's the zebra mussels that kind of cues you in. So we see those in freshwater systems. Graminoid dominated flat floodplain. I think you remember maybe my way of remembering that it was a flat floodplain was that you could drive your van right out a distance out in these areas. So these open kind of savanna, wildebeest and zebra and all these kind of roaming animals are moving across the landscape. Mangroves, coral bleaching, acidification. So that should hopefully key you into it being ocean. Saltwater system, and then permafrost, cryoplanation, and prostrate growth form. Well, we've already used the boreal forest as land of little sticks. That would be the only other appropriate one besides the tundra, right? So you might have narrowed it down to these two, but knowing that you used one already. And we talked about growing close to the ground, growing flat is a way that those tundra plants would survive. So that would be the appropriate one. Cryoplanation, remember, is like the frost heating rocks, right? The rocks kind of cryo being freezing, right? Moving up and through the surface through those freeze thaw cycles. All right, 25. 25 here is matching and dealing with photosynthesis. So this you're drawing back to that table that I had at the end of the PowerPoint. And here we're looking at a high temperature photosynthetic enzyme. When you look at our options here, lentic and lotic are dealing with water, right? Slower still water or fast moving water. ATP and NADPH, these are molecules that are precursor molecules associated with light reactions. We've got Rubisco, which we know is an enzyme. And then the other enzyme that we have is the PEP carboxylase. So we're talking about a high temperature enzyme. Remember, Rubisco didn't do so well in those high temperatures. So PEP carboxylase is the correct answer here. Photosystem 2's dark reaction. Remember, this one doesn't need the sunlight. It needs those two precursor molecules. And the output of the dark reaction, photosystem 2, should be the sugars, right? It just recycles the sugars. What is the term for fast moving water? So fast, moving with the O, right? So loaded. And most important enzyme in the world, not good at high temperatures. Tons and tons of action-packed leaf material is made up of this enzyme. And it's also the vanilla or the vanilla wafers, right? Rubisco. That's the enzyme we're talking about. Photosystem 1, light reaction products. That's the ATP and NADPH, right? The sunlight stimulating the electrons bouncing around on those photosystems, releasing that ATP energy and the NADPH, which will then be used in the dark reaction, Calvin cycle, to make the sugar. What is the slow moving or still water? Okay, so if fast moving water was loaded, lentic is that. The C3 plant molecule to which CO2 binds. So remember, stomate's open, the CO2 is coming in. What does it bind to with the help of rubisco? This is C3 plants, so stuff where we are. We looked down our list, everything's been used except for PEP and RUBP. So C3 is going to be moderate temperature type areas. So RUBP and rubisco are the pair we're talking about there, right? Rubisco is the enzyme that catalyzes the reaction where CO2 comes in and binds to that RUBP molecule. So RUBP is correct. And then the C4 and CAM plant, CO2 is coming in. And what's it going to bind to in these higher temperatures? Well, it's going to bind to PEP, and PEP carboxylase will be the enzyme that catalyzes it. Over here, we're matching our soil types, grassland soil, remember the munchies, the mollisols, the breadbasket, making our grains. Taiga, boreal forest, spongy, right? Think of me jumping out of the plane into the boggy type habitat. The Arctic tundra, permafrost, right? Tropical rainforest is poor soil because it's tied up in plants, so poor, the oxosols. And the desert is dry, so the arid, dry erisosols. All right, 27 is one of those diagrams I told you was really important, right? With precipitation and temperature. So you kind of want to orient yourself, right? It's really cold here, it's really hot here, it's really dry here, it's really wet here, okay? So on the extremes, A is cold and dry, F is warm and dry. So cold and dry might be tundra, warm and dry might be desert. The opposite would be really wet and warm, that would be your tropics, and then everything in between would be a gradient. So if this is your tropical rainforest, this might be your temperate rainforest, this might be your grassland area, and you have some boreal forests kind of grading in here too. So question part 1, which biome is represented in A? So A is cold and A is dry. So that is going to be our alpine tundra. And so if that's alpine tundra, then this is probably boreal, temperate, tropics. This is probably our grasslands. This is probably the desert. Which biome is represented in region D? So region D is up here. It's wet and it's hot and wet over here. And so that's going to be our tropics, right? Tropical rainforest. What is the most likely dominant form of vegetation in biome F? Let's go take a look. So F is really warm and really dry, right? So if we look down here, if you are warm and dry habitat, you probably won't have conifer trees. We see that kind of boreal forest. Plants that use CAM or dormancy, that kind of makes sense, right? Desert plants. You see 4 grasses, well, they might be even warmer than that, right? So that is sort of what we might see in B, perhaps. Deciduous broadleaf trees, that's the temperate forest. Small herbaceous plants that use C3 photosynthesis. Well, we know it's really warm and dry there, so C3 is not going to be efficient, right? We're going to have that photorespiration issue. So the best example of the type of vegetation that we would see here would be plants that have CAM photosynthesis, or the desert cacti and euphorbs like ocotillo, palo verde trees, and whatnot. But yeah, CAM would be appropriate. What's the most likely dominant vegetation in biome C? So then let's go look. So if this is tundra, and then this becomes boreal, and this is temperate. So we're looking for temperate, but this is tropics, right? So temperate forests, so like where we are. Conifer trees, we have some, not a ton. C4 grasses, again, some, not a ton. Largely we have kind of mixed forest, right? So these deciduous broadleaf trees. We don't have, I mean, we do have some seafood plants. We don't have any cans really to speak of, but the deciduous broadleaf trees in our forests would be the most appropriate. Unlike the aquatic habitats, biome classifications are based primarily on, now remember, we talked about the three things that kind of define a biome, but largely we said biomes are defined by the plant, right? Not by the animal or anything like that. What defines the plants are the soils, the precipitation, and the temperature. So the most appropriate answer here is the dominant plant type. And which biomes would you find animals that are strongly limited by food availability? So basically, where is it tough to live? What kind of habitat makes it tough to live? Tropics, they're doing pretty good, right? Temperate, they're doing pretty good too. We've even got some animals that are doing, pretty well in the Serengeti, grasslands and savanna type habitats, right? It's more so when you're in the tundra and when you're in the desert and there's extremes where the animals kind of run into trouble. So let's see what our answers could be. A and F, B and C, and D and E. Well, A is our tundra and F is our desert. So that would be the best fit right there. 28, getting back to data types. In two examples below, what type of data are represented? So we're talking about number of children at the Y, number of stop signs on Broad Street. So these are counts, right? So these are numbers. They're going to be quantitative type data, and quantitative data are of two types, right? They're either discrete or continuous. And because they're counts, they're whole numbers in this case. So discrete is the appropriate one. Continuous is the variable where we can measure with I would say the measure of, decimals, right? Thinking about weights, thinking about heights and lengths, those sorts of things. So discrete's those kind of whole numbers, you can truncate them. Those counts. Okay, and here we've got categories. So categorical data are not quantities, right? It's not quantitative data, it's going to be qualitative data. And qualitative data then has two different types, either ordinal or nominal. And here we have freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. You can kind of rank those, right? There's an order to them, so it would be qualitative ordinal data. Okay? So that is test one. If you have any questions you want to talk to me about anything on the test, or just kind of sit down with me and go over it again, or anything related to the content on that first unit, just reach out and we can touch base sometime when things settle following the advising week that you guys have coming up. Okay, hope you have a nice break, and I will see you guys soon. Bye.